My name is Jim Cihlar, and I was born in Omaha and grew up in Council Bluffs, Iowa, until we moved to Verdigris, Nebraska, where we lived for a year, and then after that, Omaha. And I lived in Omaha for at least 10 years, graduated from Omaha Central, and then went to the University of Iowa in Iowa City for my BA, where I studied in the Iowa Writers Workshop. And then I came to Lincoln to go to grad school here and lived here for about 11 years. Right now I'm the fiction, nonfiction editor for Etruscan Press, and I've worked in editing for many years at a number of literary presses. And I'm also a visiting instructor at Macalester College in St. Paul and a lecturer at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. My writing is, I grew up mostly in Omaha. So although I write about the Midwest and about Nebraska, it's usually an urban experience. So certainly place is important to me, but also the people and the community that I met, my family, my friends. Growing up in Omaha, there was sort of an independent artist scene. I was an intern at the Magic Theater in Omaha, Joanne Schmidman's and Megan Terry's Magic Theater. The old market was really just kind of getting started. So I remember the Craftsman's Guild by Rishon Lowe and Artist Co-op, which is still there. And going to Omaha Central, I didn't study with her, but Zunaid Lohr was a art teacher there, sort of legendary. And yeah, there were, I remember like just some of my teachers there, very encouraging people, who thought writing was important. So Dan Daly, or I think it was Mr. Daly, and Mr. Garrity, my journalism instructor. So yes, the place and the people, certainly. There did seem to me to be kind of an artist scene in Omaha. You wouldn't have expected that. I lived in South Omaha. The old market was within walking distance. And there was an artist, Tom Bartek. He's, of course, still active, still exhibiting. And he had a gallery in South Omaha that I used to pop in and visit, and I'm still in touch with Tom. And just that notion of you can do this, you can be an artist and support yourself and make a living out of doing this the way he did, in my neighborhood. It was very encouraging. And then certainly all of my professors at the U, Francis Kay, who was the editor for the Great Plains Quarterly, or my dissertation advisors, Paul A. Olson and Hilda Raz, certainly. Marcia Southwick taught classes at both Iowa and at Nebraska that I took. So I took classes from her on both campuses. And Greg Kuzma, and then just, the literary heritage of Nebraska. I took Plains literature classes. We read Sophus Keith Winther and Bess Streeter Aldrich. I took the Willa Cather seminar, and we went on a field trip to Red Cloud, I remember, with Susan Rosowski. So yes, I've always felt, a real connection. Well, as a kid, I think we all write, and I remember I had a little, my middle name is Jay, J-A-Y, and so I wrote a little comic book on construction paper, The Adventures of Jay, the Blue Jay. I think that would be the first thing. And then I wrote continuing, poetry in high school, which I'm sure was dreadful. And then I went to Iowa and I got in the undergraduate writers workshop, and that made me take it more seriously. But my favorite answer to that question comes from Wallace Stevens. I think he said it in Writing the Australian Crawl, or one of his books. They asked him, he said he likes to take that question and turn it around. He likes to say, not when did he start writing, but when did the other people stop. Because I do think that we all have that instinct and that, habit and desire within us. You know, as an editor, sometimes I feel pulled a little bit toward, it's honestly, I've had to struggle with that because you would think they'd be competing instincts and they're not. To work on your own writing and to work on somebody else's writing, in fact, is two different instincts. But it's very tempting sometimes to spend all of your time working on somebody else's writing, maybe just as a avoidance strategy or as procrastination. So finding the time, just in a working life, can be difficult. But once you get into a rhythm, a habit of it, it's very enjoyable, and you kind of want to keep it going so that you can, the writing does improve when you're in that kind of jag. The other thing I've found, I write poems, but I also write prose, and so having little assignments, I write book reviews and interviews. I have book reviews for the Minneapolis Star Tribune or for a website called Cold Front. And then I've got an interview with D.A. Powell, a San Francisco poet coming out in the American Poetry Review. And I've interviewed Ted Kooser as well for the Star Tribune. Brent Spencer I've interviewed also. So having that deadline, even that nominal paycheck at the end of it all, makes me take the writing more seriously and makes me set aside time to do it. Well, in addition to all the people, that I've just mentioned and the place, I'm teaching a class now, American Poetry since 1900 at the University of Minnesota. And so it's been a chance for me to reread all the poets that I remember loving and first meeting in my creative writing classes at Iowa. So James Wright, for instance, his poem Among Sunflowers, Theodore Rothke's poem The Waking, and let's see now, Sylvia Plath's poem Mirror, Richard Hugo. I probably read sort of those Midwestern poets that had kind of vivid imagery and sort of plain colloquial speech at a time when they were most likely being taught pretty widely in writing programs, and they stuck with me. So just something about their view of the world and their view toward language, I think, informs. Some of the themes that I write about, I think there's just a concern with language and the various sort of forms of language. Some of my more recent poems are kind of collages of, say, popular culture. I do tend to write in response to things that I see or view or read. So some of my poems are sort of reading poems where I'm interpreting a book that I've recently read. So language itself. I also write a little bit about films in dialogue with particularly old movies, like old Hollywood movies, and inspirations. You're asking about themes, I believe. So themes are sort of language. Also, there's something about, in my poems, often a theme of the fragility of life or the fragility of the body, and how you can live sort of by the book, and yet things can still very suddenly change. Mm-hmm. I usually have to get charged up to write. Sometimes that's by reading a book or watching a film, taking notes while I'm doing so. It used to be by going for walks. You have to kind of get that, that kind of ruminative process going in your head first, and then you do need to let it, or at least I feel like I need to let it gestate for a bit before I'm ready to put it down on paper. Yeah, I think it is changing. My first book, Undoing, is really pretty autobiographical. It has poems in it about my parents and about my sisters and brother, about Nebraska. And in my new book, or my new chapbook, Metaphysical Bailout, the title, for instance, comes from, just the language of the 2008 crash, and just sort of the ways that we kind of rushed to find words to describe what was happening with the economic system, and sort of some of the ironies that maybe I found embedded in the ways that we really tried to make sound new something that was in fact very old. Just sort of another excuse to reinstitute the underlying class system of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, but we now have a new name for it. So, and that makes it feel more excusable somehow. I think I write for that kind of character trait in all of us that loves language. So these poets that I mentioned, and one thing I will say as a poet, I'm grateful for anyone who reads and pays attention. But beyond that, I write for that character trait in all of us that appreciates the sounds of language, that appreciates sort of juxtapositions of words and images that you wouldn't normally see in daily discourse, that somehow create vivid images and ideas. I think the best thing I got written on my poems in the workshop, for instance, Marcia Southwick would write at the bottom of every poem, "Keep writing." That was usually it. But that was enough. I listened to her. So keep at it. I think, honestly, it's probably easier for people now, younger people starting now, with the number of online journals and, yeah. So keep at it and keep sending the stuff out. I'm starting to write short stories now, so I'm starting to write prose. And also I do have a new manuscript that I'm shopping around. It's called Rancho Nostalgia, and it is a collection of poems that are in response to, again, Golden Age Hollywood movies. Movies like Johnny Guitar or Rancho Notorious is a movie that was made in the 50s, a Western with Marlene Dietrich. It has a lot of poems in response to film noir. Yeah. I'm going to read the title poem to Undoing. And this book, I mentioned, I think, that my dad, when we lived in Council Bluffs, he worked in Omaha, but he had a little hobby farm in Underwood, Iowa. And we used to drive around all the bluffs and the just little towns around Council Bluffs. And so this poem has some reference to just all the little roads and supper clubs in that part of the state. And so I'll start with Undoing, the title poem. Then I'll read the title poem, Metaphysical Bailout, which I mentioned is sort of a critique, meditation on sort of the language of finance and of the economy. And then I'll read, I live in a house in St. Paul now that was built in 1885. It's an old kind of folk Victorian, and it's shingled on the exterior, and one of the shingles has fallen off, and there's sort of a little opening, must have gone into an old coal-burning stove or something, but a bird has taken nest in that. And so I'm going to read the poem Bird, Bath, and Beyond about that. And then another poem called Epistemology Roadshow, which sort of, again, goes along with the language of finance. And a poem called The Past Used to Be Unlived, which is it's divided into 6 sections, and it's about the various jobs that I worked during the summers when I was in grad school in Lincoln. And I'll read the poems I mentioned, Rancho Nostalgia. There's 2 of those. Then I might read, depending on time, I might read some of the new work. So I went to England last summer, to teach at a poetry workshop. So I have a poem called English Poem, a poem called King Arthur and His Mob, which is in response to the Shirley Temple movie Little Miss Marker, and also has a little bit about my mother in there. And then a poem, this is one of my reading poems, it's called The Reality Show, and it is about Tilly Olson's book, short story, I Stand Here Ironing. It also has a reference to Maxine Hong Kingston's Warrior, the Woman Warrior, the Warrior Woman, I think it is. And then finally, a couple poems. The Projectionist. I taught Survey of British Lit 2 last fall, so I was reading people like Matthew Arnold, the Victorians and the Romantics, and the Projectionist plays a little bit with some of their notions. And then finally, The Normal Lives of Good People, which is a reference, it's a line in a film noir, kind of a forgotten film noir that's set in Chicago.
Excited that this reading series has been in existence for more than 25 years. The Ames readings are currently held on the third Sunday of the month at 2 p.m. And I thank you for being here. And this is the 197th reading. We're getting close to that 200 mark. Well, here we are in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room. This is a special collection dedicated to promoting and preserving works by and about Nebraska authors. This is a representative collection of more than 13,000 volumes written by more than 3,000 Nebraska authors. And we do have other things in the room too, information files, magazines, pictures, manuscripts, artwork. If you look around the room, you'll see artwork on the walls and other memorabilia. And by the way, the Heritage Room is not tax supported. It is supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association. And we'd like to thank the NLHA for the endowment established a number of years ago through their volunteer efforts. We invite you to visit the Heritage Room during our regular public service hours. We're open Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3 and on Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5. And actually, we are featuring the Ames reading during our Sunday afternoon hours. So again, I'm glad you're here. The Ames readings are filmed by 5 City TV. And if you're not here in the Heritage Room with us today, but you're watching on Channel 5, then I just want you to know that we're located on the 3rd floor of Bennett Martin Public Library, downtown 14th and N Streets, Lincoln. Our reader today is James Cihlar. He was born in Omaha, but he currently lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. He has 1 degree from the University of Iowa and several from UNL. His writing includes poetry, essays, book reviews, interviews, and features. He is the review editor for American Poetry Journal and nonfiction editor for Etruscan Press. The recipient of a Minnesota State Arts Board Fellowship for Poetry and a Glenn Alushai Award from the Prairie Schooner. He's also a visiting instructor at Macalester College in St. Paul right now. And I'm sure there are a few other things that I've not included there. But anyway, his recent publications include Undoing, which was published by Little Pear Press in 2008, and Metaphysical Bailout by Pudding House Press in 2010. And we're very happy to have James here with us today. And if you could help me welcome him, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Meredith. And thanks to everyone for coming out. It's great to see old friends in the audience. And thanks as well to the Bennett Martin Public Library and to the Nebraska Heritage Room for hosting this series, which I took part in 10 years, maybe more, maybe longer than that. So I'd be happy to fill out the next 3 to get you up to 200 if... let's see. So today I'm reading poems from, I'm just going to read one poem from my book, Undoing, and then mostly poems from my chapbook, Metaphysical Bailout, as well as some new poems. And I'll start with the title poem from Undoing. This poem is, pretty self-explanatory. It is about my family to some extent, and my family lived in Omaha and Council Bluffs, and my father had a little farm outside of Council Bluffs that we used to drive around and stop in at the various cafes and supper clubs, and that made an impression on me as a kid. So here we go, undoing. Unfamiliar with the logic of the physical world, as a kid I did not understand repair. My mother warned, if you break that lamp, we can't replace it. But I couldn't believe her. The world can't be that stingy. Not the same world of tulips erupting from bulbs, moths emerging from cocoons, smooth upholstery cradling my cheek in the back seat of my father's Chevy, driving back roads to supper clubs, cornflake-crusted fried chicken, doughy dinner rolls, so much food I had to push the plate away. There must be a scientific process by which something broken can be restored entirely, the mistake undone, nothing lost. Today, a commercial tells me that a fire in one room can damage a whole house. A woman drapes a shawl over a space heater and it announces flames. I have littered the past year with anxiety, and it is spilling over into the rest of the house. Taking it on, my cat breaks a figurine on the vanity. Make it like it never happened, the commercial promises. Even if I glued the shards together, I would comprehend the fissures webbing the porcelain, the pressure points of weakness, which is my undoing. Having broken many things in my life, I have grown to accept we could undo anything if only we could forget. I should have asked, can you hear me okay? Yeah. And this is all working? Okay, good. Actually, I might read just a couple more poems from this book. Let me see now. This one's called Janice's Thank Yous. Watching Swing Time on cable, I see my friend Janice in Ginger Rogers saying thank you to a hotel clerk. Janice, the same woman who has talked to me about sex lives, the same whom I called when my boss fired me in a drug-induced fit of paranoia. What does it mean to be from Nebraska? A willingness to uncensor, and yet the memory of a big, old-fashioned downtown with department stores, cafeterias, civility. Whenever I see Astaire's googly eyes, his receding hairline, his can't sing, can't act, can dance a little foppery, I'm reminded of my first partner, also from Nebraska, probably still there, in a brown and painted house that once looked fresh, now looks faded, the one who tracked me down once to stare at me from the hallway as I taught a college night course. Then he walked by without saying a word to me. My husband is out of town for a week, and I did something I don't usually do. I stayed home and watched TV in the living room, as he often does on the couch, with Alice the cat sleeping on his legs. One of us is in transit, in motion, at risk, and the other needs to keep our place safe for return. And just because Julie's in the audience, I feel like I should read The Road to Colorado for Julie Thompson-Walla. Once, driving down the road that had been laid down before us, between the brown and burnt hills of eastern Colorado, you told me of the time your husband crossed the line into oncoming traffic, pushed by the wind. You had to grab the wheel. Every day now you cross the line of divorce, piecing one moment to the next, how one turn of the wheel sets you back on your trajectory, into sweet honey in the rock, on the stereo, a glass of wine with your boyfriend, candles lit on the mantel, a poem contest with your friends, the phone answered with a laugh. What tells us where to go? At 25, we see the future mapped by promises we take for guarantees. At 35, we know for every poem we write, there must be more that we could have written. What if God changed his mind? If you were me, you'd spend your time spinning from city to city, imagining yourself into new houses, new jobs, living two lives at once. But you take the wheel, hold your face into the wind, let your black hair stream behind you, as you hold to the curve in the gray road, to old cities where you once lived, grown bigger than you remember, to old friends you've always had, grown closer than you imagined. So those were from Undoing, and then these next poems are from Metaphysical Bailout. If the poems in my first book maybe had a bit more autobiographical content, these poems perhaps are responding to external texts, such as movies, books I've read, and also simply the news, because I was writing this sort of when or soon after the stock market crash. And so just the language that we had developed around talking about those events sort of inspired some of these poems. And so I'll read the first one, the title poem called Metaphysical Bailout, and it begins with a quote from Beatrix Potter. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. My endeavor is an assemblage of tissue, bone, and nerve whose code is to lift me up, the engine of music, an enterprise of cells, a confederacy of one. Even though she's seen it a million times, the projectionist lets the well-worn movie run itself out. With so many plot lines, a variable of success is where she could choose to stop it, but doesn't. Wasting away, his winnowed frame left paw prints all over the house, in the Pied Piper's apocalyptic jig toward death. Even then, he waited until the last minute before opening that door. Who wouldn't milk the most out of what he's got, gambling on fate's prerogative to reverse itself? Scott said, I choose not to portray my father. Sometimes we don't have a choice. We have to go until the going is gone. Once the gears start moving, all sorts of mystical things happen, a web of causality. Somewhere is the part that doesn't move. We are storing it for the future. Bless the active quiet around it, the value of space surrounding. I will pump ions in the air with my pink fibrous bellows, a campaign declaiming stasis but banking on a fall. A child is too young to manage his body, biting down on pennies, scratching a pox. How the physical can change in an instant due to bad decisions, a head stuck out of a car window on a bridge, a human finger in a bowl of chili, nerds and Pepsi. I've made it past those fears of life-altering fragmentation, unwittingly committing a crime and going to jail, honestly answering a question that betrays my parents. Shouldn't it go both ways, and the world slip so that what was once red is now black, and what they all know they now admit? How I wish to be lovely. Once the frame of reference changes, our signature qualities will emerge from the post-diluvial silt to shine hallelujah. When the world rights itself, bears will turn into bulls, mammoths into racehorses, heavy dinosaurs into fine-boned birds. We'll be seen for who we are, and the past won't matter anymore. I live in a house in St. Paul that was built in 1885, and there is I heard working in my study on the second floor, kind of a scratching in the walls, and I just assumed it was mice. And then I noticed that there was sort of a shadow flying to and from the window, and realized there was a bird that had taken nest in sort of an old exposed stovepipe that had opened up once the shingle had fallen off. And so this poem is called Bird, Bath, and Beyond. We hear it before our afternoon nap, a scratching in the walls like mice scurrying, or a phantom branch dragging in the wind 2 stories up where no trees reach. From outside we see a shingle has fallen away, exposing the opening for an old stovepipe, dead-ended by plaster or the inside. A bird has made her nest in the hole in the wall, a cliff dweller bathed in sunlight more generous than any cast in last July, From below, we see her beak protruding out of the tall plane of shingles, her profiles bob and jerk as she holds sentinel. Back inside, we rest our heads against the plaster, the bird and the wall. Beyond October, it is hard to say if safety will remain in unlikely places, but in our hearts we hope it will. And then this next poem, sort of going back to the theme of sort of language about finance and the economy, but it also is, I love the show Antiques Roadshow on public television, and this is inspired a little bit by it. It's called Epistemology Roadshow. Wind busies the bare branches, and always the birds diving the feeder. Phrases from an antiques program, folly, ephemera, provenance. The author of Don't Sweat the Small Stuff died unexpectedly at age 45. China sleeps in my basement. I write without seeing. Querulous Paul Lind says goodbye to wife Imogene Coca in Under the Yum Yum Tree. See you at lunch, I can't wait. Keep reaching into the past to grab something new. Here is the spine of the poem. I will find worth there. I will hold worry like a rocket. I'll kick it in the sand. I will lay it down. I will bring my case to the table. I will ready myself for an appraisal. And when I lived in Lincoln, I, as a grad student, I worked at a variety of part-time jobs or temporary jobs over the summer. Usually, like, my assistantship would sort of pay for the school year, and then I'd be on my own for the summer. So this poem, it's divided into 6 stanzas, each 7 lines long, and it's about those various jobs. It's called The Past Used to Be Unlived. In the Haymarket, at the dairy's factory, our job was to climb a stepladder to dump expired milk from single cartons into a giant carton. The stench was foul, biological, familiar. We didn't ask why we had to do this. We assumed that like belongs with like. 2. The foreman told me to move an ancient truck from the lot to the loading dock. Once in her new Honda Civic DX, my sister had tried and failed to teach me how to drive a stick. The day I had to do it on my own, I pressed the clutch and shifted gears. 3. Riding shotgun in the semi's open cab, I jumped out when the driver paused at a curb, the engine pumping and exhaling, carried cast-off furniture that residents had dumped into the truck, and hopped back in the cab before he roared away. One day was not enough to pick it all up. 4. The field boss called at 5 a.m., and I went to the grain silos near the railroad tracks south of town. Men younger and healthier than I lifted themselves by their palms over the retaining wall to the open vats of wheat. Our job was to break up the crusted surface, 30 degrees hotter than the day's temperature, with shovels. Blind pink families of mice saw sunlight for the first time. 5. When the agent would not reveal the work entailed, I showed up anyway at the campus maintenance facility, with 2 undergraduates stranded in town that summer. The superintendent lowered us into a cistern, gave us gloves, masks, and putty knives, and told us to scrape crude oil off the walls. I climbed out and drove home. 6. My summer job in high school was working as a clerk at Second Chance Antiques in the Old Market. I hung Maxfield Parrish prints, bought an Art Deco tie with my employee discount, and watched Casablanca at the nearby Revival Theater. Back then, the past was another country I could visit. Today, it is an almanac of possibilities. I might read just a couple of the movie poems. I mentioned I'd been writing poems in response to films. And so this one, it's called Johnny Guitar, and it's based on the movie that has Joan Crawford in it. It was made in the 50s. I think the poem will explain the rest of it. So Johnny Guitar, it's divided into short sections, 5. So here's one. In the office politics of the American West, you have to hate someone you don't know. I'd like to say Emma burns down Vienna's saloon because she loves her and can't admit it. But that's not the case. They love the same thing, not the dancing kid, but power, success. Each will find it her own way. That's why they hate each other. 2. Emma is more man than woman. She makes other ranchers feel like less than men. When she tortures a confession out of an innocent boy, they back her up like a church choir. Young Goodman Brown meets 50s Western kitsch. After Vienna kills her, they punch their time cards like workers on the clock. 3. Everything here is as it seems. The abandoned mine shaft under the saloon that Johnny Guitar and Vienna used to escape is known to all. Even the dancing kid's hideout, which he reaches by passing through a waterfall, is at the top of a hill in plain sight. Before the railroad comes to this desert, as in any workplace, no one doubts the truth of what we don't talk about. 4. You'd think once the ranchers learn that Vienna's hired hand is really a sharpshooter, they'd give him some space. Instead, they set him up. They throw him under the bus. I mean, they stab him in the back. Ignoring the muscular strength of his neck shaft, they issue an ultimatum. Get out in 24 hours. Just long enough for 2 seasoned professionals, Crawford and Hayden, to ignore their childish co-workers and flirt like mature adults. 5. I held up no stagecoach. I robbed no bank. Why do you come here? I knew you would, but why? I know, and I know you know, I am innocent. That's why I sit here in my spotless white gown, playing my spinet piano. It's my job. For the last half of the movie, my saloon will burn on Main Street, my story heaped upon it, with everyone's before me, who was sacrificed for greed. Let the others reap the benefits. I gave up the dancing kid a long time ago. I like being by myself. I'll unroll the moment like a carpet. I will furnish it like a home. And then I have another poem that's also sort of inspired by a 1950s Western, which is, this one was directed by Fritz Lang, stars Marlene Dietrich, and it was called Rancho Notorious. And I'm writing this poem in Marlene Dietrich's, or her character's voice, and it's called Rancho Nostalgia. No one knows where I went, from the Ace of Hearts to the Peso Saloon. When they remember me, they either laugh or spit. I could ride a man as well as a horse, canter him up to the bar and down a shot of whiskey while he bucked. After I won at Birdcage, I bought a ranch close to the border, where the light is good. A place to step outside of time, to grow my hair and nails, to let my teeth get long. Tell the girls to wear their crinolines or twirl their parasols. It's hard work being beautiful, being someone else's pipe dream in blue denim or a birthday dress. I needed a break from singing, from my face aging in the mirror, from hate, murder, and revenge. My rules are simple. No one asks any questions, and I get 10% of everything. I went from the eastern seaboard to the old Southwest in search of an education, longing for one man to change me from water to wine. I found my alchemy the day I set foot in Chuckaluk. I knew at once everything the town would not tell me, the way color floods the wrecked sky over the desert. I didn't waste my time with worry. I learned with my body. I was as smooth on the ground as on the back of a horse. I listened to my bloodstream and I recognized the town's complicity with silence. Everything was fine until Lucky came along, nursing a broken heart for his girl, outraged and butchered by Kinch, who spared her nothing. Lucky was always standing in doorways. He was always using his eyes. I wished he would go away and come back 10 years ago. We all get taken sooner or later. That's the bargain we make with time. After years of steady stewardship, we let our guard down once, and it is enough for the whole enterprise to crash to the floor. Let it be known, I'll go along with dying at the end, as long as it's understood that my death is the result of a mistake. And then I have another poem called Rancho Nostalgia 2, which begins with a quote from a Daffy Duck cartoon called The Scarlet Pumpernickel. And the quote is, "My room, bumpkin, I'm pooped." "So you're going to put up a fight," the diner says to her steak. I wanted something nice, a girandole, a nocturne, not a pink necessary chair or a map of injustices. A synthetic CEO, all parade down Wall Street, wearing a diadem of wheat, waving a scepter of corn. My stock in trade is memory, exchanging shares of Time for Life magazine. Nostalgia occurs when affection for some past self overcomes the will to create a new one. The mind's enterprise is to erode the surfaces of objects until they become words. There is no subsidy program for the factory of the self. Just some feelings overlaid by others, giving an answer to a previous moment of failure. What about that moment when the body was a vessel for the future's operation? It is still alive. He makes me remember myself a long time back. Nostalgia for the past's future. Sure, I'm tired. We'll take turns resting our heads on death's pillow. Look at me now, haters, not commenting on, but living. I just wanted the chance to use the word haters, because I love that. It seems so appropriate. And then I'll close just by reading a few new poems. I went to, let's see, actually, here's a poem, also a movie poem. It's called King Arthur and His Mob, which is a line from the movie Little Miss Marker, starring Shirley Temple. So King Arthur and His Mob. Afloat of femininity, Bangles Carson rides the white upright through the horseshoe cabaret, accompanied by her trio on a violin-shaped barge pulled by two little men in bellboy uniforms. I've got to be where I am and do what I do. Her odalisque back drips off the edge of the piano. The black sequins slide down her thighs with her hands. Light twinkles and bubbles, and the jazz pours inside us like Coca-Cola. I'm a black sheep who's blue. The slumming hoi polloi smile indulgently. Cafe society laughs knowingly, and the ragamuffin worships her up close, crabbing her act. Her float is wisdom. Even the Black Knight can't help but dance. During the divorce, my father called my mother unfit, and it was like casting a spell. She fell into another plane of being, a woman underwater mouthing words, gesturing with her hands for help. Bangles stomps through the rest of the movie in a confection of tulle, a storm of feathers, an organdy collar off of a Perot costume. Maybe I'll dig up a guy who'll give and let me keep. Sir Sorry buys a better home for Shirley Temple. Passed around like a sack of potatoes, by the gangsters guessing her weight. Thrown from a horse at a party, she finds safety in the underworld. My mother's face surfacing from sleep in the hospital. Who knows how many lives she swam through on the other side. Bangles sings Shirley a lullaby. Thank your lucky stars you've got a bed. You'll grow up to find it all a racket. I propose as follows. You go to sleep. And then last summer I taught a couple of poetry workshops over in Nottingham. So it was my first trip to England, and loved it over there. And so here's a poem that resulted. It's called English Poem. Ward Pottery business card holder. A gray rabbit looks quizzically at the space where name and title should appear. People I've helped who help me now. The gap between train and platform, reality and expectation. Time is running oblique. The Victorians believed 4 humors flow through all of us, an ocean of bile, islands of flesh. Dresden was an answer to Coventry. If history is a country we can visit, then Hitler, Roosevelt, and Churchill are rag dolls in the future's toy box, trading cards in the same hologram deck. Julian of Norwich asked to be bricked in a wall in order to get to heaven sooner. Visitors fed her through a break in the mortar. I believe that evil belongs together. Mussolini and the Lockerbie bomber sitting at the same lunchroom cafeteria table. And that everything that survives deserves our love. Salvation is on the other side of the world. I promise that a detour is a diversion, as surely as I know that we will someday fly outside the atmosphere for faster travel. Today, a team of English scientists discovered a monster star 10 million times brighter than our sun. Hell falls away the moment when the boaters on the lake wave to the tourists on the shore. Let's see. This poem called The Reality Show references Tilly Olson's short story, I Stand Here Ironing. So, The Reality Show. Nervous and too public, Tilly smothers Emily with anxious love, shuffling her off to the convalescent home for teens at the bidding of the zeitgeist. I cannot become cold in front of the blackboard, my shins covered in sequins. When Maxine's nameless aunt brought shame to the family through illegitimate pregnancy, the villagers pillaged the farm, murdering pigs, chickens, and cows. More of the economic pie for me, the rapist said afterward. It's not the doctors and the lawyers and the factory bosses themselves. It's what floats in the air that rules us, our mad attempts to figure out the puzzle, to guess our positions on the board and jump ahead. In spite of the Cold War, Emily becomes a gifted actress. Maxine counsels veterans in sunny California. Pointing my finger at individuals while I address the group, I speak the language of people living on subtlety. It is a long road to moxie. Clad in a coat of eyes, we bear the headache of injustice, our every movement part of the record, writing stories backward to make sense. Just a couple more to finish. I have another movie poem. This one's called The Normal Lives of Good People, and which is a line from a film noir called The Arnello Affair. And this movie is set in Chicago. Her face is the Wrigley building lit at night, her eyes billboards, the ponderous tilt and nod, the reverent. Somewhere, a starlet lies murdered. A kiss can last an hour, while her husband's plebeian love crashes over her in waves of monotone sentiment, a disembodied voice that haunts her walk through the impassive. Things must be handled slowly, touched carefully, the objects larger than our hands. Her son's composition notebook, a Victorian novel. A nightclub party, the Nuremberg trials, while the starlet's body seeps into the carpet. One day Chicago will slip into the lake. When the edifice of her face sinks to the table, everyone in Arnello's turns to watch beauty part her lips. And so sort of, again, following on the theme of movies and cinema, this last poem that I'll read is called The Projectionist. Is it pathetic to see the insides outside? Matthew Arnold thought the sea was sad. Then he realized it was him. I don't know how the world works, how a friend becomes a stranger, what a murder looks like on the face. A hurricane. Brush lightly as you pass. Sometimes an age just ends. A monarch dies somewhere. An angel gets his wings. There are 1,649 shades of gray. All you can do is keep your pathways clear. Life happens. Celluloid culture becomes cellular culture. Anita Hill's college students didn't know who she was. We all get ahead on someone else's pain. Once you start rewinding, you have to go back to the beginning. Everything we touch becomes infected. I won't end like that. No rosebud, no I don't give a damn, no lovers on the beach. Dial it back to Paul Henreid in a white dinner jacket. It's good to feel generous. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for being here today. It's great to have you. I am going to give you a dry one to take home with you.
I would have bought that if you hadn't yet.